My father smirked. "You're finally pulling your weight." After I covered nearly every wedding bill for my brother, I stood up, took the microphone, and said, "Consider this my farewell gift, because you'll never spend another dollar of mine again." The first time I realized the wedding was turning into my problem, I was standing in my truck outside the catering hall with my phone in one hand and a balance due email in the other. It was supposed to be one small favor. My younger brother, Matt, was getting married. My father had called it a family event from the beginning, which sounded harmless until the requests started coming in one after another like they were all somehow temporary, and I was the only one who could keep the whole thing from falling apart. I was the one with the stable job. I was the one with decent credit. I was the one who did not panic when a bill showed up. So I ended up being the one paying for the photographer deposit, then the venue upgrade, then the rehearsal dinner, then the hotel block, then the transportation, then the extra dessert table my father insisted would make the reception look more respectable. At first, I told myself it was just helping. I told myself that because it was easier than admitting I was already annoyed. Matt was younger than me by 4 years and had always been the one who somehow got rescued before he even had to ask. If he needed a new tire, my father handled it. If he needed help with rent, my father handled it. If he needed a little cash to bridge the gap between jobs, my father handled it. I had paid my own way since I was 18, so I think some part of me wanted to believe this was the one time it would be different. It was not. The first invoice came through my email, because the venue listed me as the billing contact for the deposit. That seemed normal enough since I had covered it on my card to keep the date reserved. The second invoice had a higher number than I expected. The third had charges for things I had never heard anyone discuss. The fourth had a note from the planner saying the final guest count had changed again. That one made me sit down in the truck and stare at the screen long enough for my coffee to go cold. At that point, I had already spent more than I had planned. Not ruinously more, but enough that I noticed it. Enough that I started moving money around in my head and realizing the bathroom renovation I had been putting off was going to stay postponed. Enough that I checked my savings balance twice because I wanted to be sure I was not overreacting. I still did not say no. That was probably my first real mistake. My father was very good at making everything sound temporary. He could make a request feel like an emergency, and then, 2 days later, act like it had always been obvious that I would cover it. He had a way of looking at me like I was being difficult when I asked for details. He never raised his voice right away. He did this slow, disappointed thing instead, like I was a child who should have known better. When Matt got engaged, my father started talking about how weddings brought out what people were really made of. He said that the family would remember who stepped up. He said that it was not just about money, it was about showing loyalty. I was already wary by then, but I still did not think he was aiming all of that at me. I thought he was just being dramatic in the way he always was. I was wrong about that too. The engagement happened at the end of spring. By early summer, I had already covered the venue deposit and the photographer retainer. By midsummer, I had been asked to handle the florist because the planner needed payment faster than Matt expected. By late summer, I had been told the original catering estimate was not enough because they wanted a plated dinner instead of buffet, and had also decided to add a premium bar package. That was the first time I asked why nobody had checked with me before changing the numbers. Matt blamed the planner. My father blamed the timeline. Both of them acted as if the real problem was my curiosity. The thing that made it worse was that there were moments when it almost felt sincere. Matt would thank me in private. He would tell me the wedding would not happen the way his fiancée wanted if I did not help. He would say he appreciated me, and for a few seconds I would remember us as kids, before the family started sorting itself into favorites and placeholders. Then my father would show up and make it feel transactional again. He would mention, casually and in front of other people, that I was finally contributing in a meaningful way. He would say things like I was the dependable one for once, or that it was nice to see me doing something for the family instead of always keeping score. That last part was rich, considering he was the one who had been keeping score since I was a teenager. I did not understand the scale of it until I started organizing receipts. I am not naturally a spreadsheet guy, but I became one in the span of about 2 weeks. I created a folder in my email. I saved every invoice. I took screenshots of texts. I started putting dates, amounts, and vendor names into a simple document because I had a sinking feeling I was going to need it. I told myself I was doing it for my own sanity. That was true, but only partly. I was also beginning to suspect that if I did not keep records, the story would get rewritten around me. That suspicion turned out to be exactly right. The first real warning sign came from the tux fitting. Matt and his fiancée, Hannah, were there with my father. I had been told the tux payment had already been handled, so I was just there to pick up my measurements and make sure mine matched the group order. The shop owner pulled up the account, frowned, and said that one of the accessory packages had been billed to the same card I used for the venue. I did not remember approving that. The package included upgraded cufflinks, a belt rental, and some premium alterations for the groomsmen who had waited until the last minute. None of that was a huge amount by itself. That was what made it dangerous. All these little charges were behaving like water dripping into a bucket. You do not notice one drip. Then suddenly you are carrying the bucket and wondering why your arms hurt. I asked the shop owner to show me the receipt. It was sent to my email. It had my name on the form. It also had my father cop it on it, which I had not noticed because I had only glanced at the subject line before paying it. That was the first time I opened the original email chain instead of just the invoice. My father had responded to the shop with a short note saying I would handle it. Not might, not probably, would. He had done that in several other places too, which I found out only because I started searching my inbox for every version of the wedding vendor names I could think of. What I found made my stomach drop. There were threads where he had answered in my place. There were threads where he had told the florist to send the updated bill to me. There were threads where he had told the planner to copy me on final balances while leaving him and Matt as the primary approvers. In other words, he had not just assumed I would help. He had started speaking for me. I sat in my kitchen that night with my laptop open and a legal pad beside me, reading through messages I had missed because I trusted the family chain too much. That part bothered me more than the money. The money was real, but it was also manageable if I stayed calm. What bothered me was the casualness of it, the ease, the fact that my father had treated my account like a spare drawer. I did not confront anyone that night. I wanted to, but I knew from experience that if I went in angry, the conversation would become about my tone instead of the actual problem. So I kept my mouth shut and started gathering evidence. I made a list of every charge I had personally approved. I made a separate list of charges that had been added later without my approval. I called the venue, the photographer, and the florist to ask for itemized statements. I did not accuse anybody of anything. I just asked for copies of all approval emails and balance adjustments. The answers were polite, but they were also revealing. The venue had notes from my father asking about extra chairs and a different linens package. The florist had an email where Matt asked for more centerpieces after the final estimate had already been sent. The photographer had a message from Hannah saying she had assumed I was covering the upgraded album package because I was the one who seemed organized. That one irritated me so much I had to stand up and walk around the house for a minute. I was being turned into the default payer because I was the only one who kept my head down and paid on time. The more I looked, the clearer the pattern became. Nobody had actually asked me what my limit was. They had just kept spending as if the limit was whatever I had not noticed yet. I started getting angry, but it was a slow, cold kind of anger, the kind that makes you more careful instead of louder. I sent myself every statement. I checked my card alerts. I changed the password on the email account tied to the wedding vendors. I called the bank to make sure there were no authorized recurring charges I had forgotten about. There were not, which was a relief, but I still felt stupid for needing to check. At the next family dinner, my father acted like nothing was wrong. He sat at the table, ate half his meal, and made a comment about how nice it was that some people in the family had finally learned how to contribute. He did not even have the decency to look embarrassed when he said it. Matt laughed too fast, which told me he had heard that line before. Hannah looked uncomfortable, but she did not say anything. That was another thing I learned during this whole mess. A lot of people will quietly enjoy a lie as long as it is keeping the room pleasant. I did not argue at dinner. I was not ready. Instead, I asked for the wedding ledger. I said it casually, like I was only trying to make sure the payments lined up. That request changed the energy at the table immediately. My father looked at me like I had asked for his bank login. Matt said the planner had everything under control. I said I was not asking about the planner. I was asking for the list of charges that had been billed to me. My father told me I was making a big deal out of nothing. That was when I knew there was something he did not want me to see. So I kept my face calm and asked again. I said I needed the list because I was the one paying it. My father laughed under his breath and said I was finally pulling my weight, which sounded almost like a compliment if you ignored the smirk on his face. I remember looking at him for a second and realizing that he believed he had already won. He thought I was trapped by politeness. He thought I was too embarrassed to back out. He thought if he applied enough family pressure, I would just keep writing checks until the wedding was over and then sit quietly with whatever resentment I had left. That was the moment I stopped trying to guess what he wanted and started figuring out what I could prove. I got the ledger 2 days later because the planner, thankfully, was more professional than my family. She sent me a full breakdown of every deposit, every balance adjustment, and every last-minute add-on. The numbers were ugly. The original projected amount was already substantial. The final total was almost $10,000 higher. Some of that was legitimate, like the guest count increasing by a small amount and the bar package changing. Some of it was not. There were charges for upgrades that had been added after the contract deadline. There were line items for extras that nobody had discussed with me. There were also notes showing that my father had approved several of those additions over the phone. Not me, him. That changed the picture immediately. I was not just covering the wedding. I was paying for his decisions. I sat there with the ledger open, feeling my jaw tighten so hard it started to ache. Then I noticed something else. A few of the approval notes referred to a backup card ending in digits I did not recognize. At first, I thought it was maybe a typo. Then I called the planner, not to accuse her, just to ask if the extra card had ever actually gone through. She hesitated before answering, which told me everything I needed to know. It had not been a typo. My father had tried to keep a second payment method on file without telling me. The planner had not processed it because the transaction failed. That was the point where I stopped feeling like I was being merely used and started feeling like I was being actively managed. I asked the planner to forward me every approved invoice and every revision request. She did. One of the emails attached to the account had my father on it with a note saying that the family was handling the wedding costs and that I was the point of contact for billing only. That line made me laugh once, but it was not a funny laugh. It was the sound you make when something finally becomes too ridiculous to pretend it is normal. I printed everything. I put it in a folder. I kept the folder in my truck for the next week because I did not trust myself to leave it in the house where anyone could wander through it. The wedding was now 3 weeks away. I still had not decided how hard I wanted to come down on them. Part of me wanted to cut my losses immediately and let the event crack apart under its own stupidity. Another part of me kept thinking about Matt, who was not the one sending the emails and not the one making the family feel like a business with me as the uncooperative investor. That part was the problem. I cared enough to hesitate. My father knew that. He had always known it. He had spent my entire life mistaking my patience for weakness. In the days that followed, I started saying no in small ways. I told them I would not cover the upgraded shuttle service. I said the welcome drinks were already more than I had agreed to. I said the floral arch was outside my budget. Every time, there was a fresh little performance of disappointment. My father would act like I was jeopardizing the wedding. Matt would act hurt. Hannah would try to mediate. Then somebody would bring up how much I had already spent, as if that erased my right to stop. The irony was that every time they tried to guilt me, they only made me more disciplined. I wrote down every new request. I answered in writing whenever I could. I stopped taking phone calls without follow-up texts. I refused to approve anything that did not come with a clear vendor invoice. That was when the tone changed, not all at once. It shifted little by little. My father started leaving me out of casual updates. Matt started acting nervous when I asked for receipts. Hannah started communicating with me directly less often and through my father more often. That was not an accident. They had realized I was no longer a blank check, so they began routing around me. One of the weirdest moments came when I found out the wedding cake had been upgraded. Not because anyone had mentioned it to me, because I got a card decline alert from the bakery and called to ask why a second-tier addition had been requested. The bakery manager explained, very politely, that the upgrade had been approved by the groom and his father, and that the invoice had been sent to my email because I was listed as the billing contact. I told her I had not approved that amount. She sounded immediately embarrassed and said she would put the charge on hold. That was the first time I felt genuinely relieved, not because of the money, because somebody outside the family had just confirmed that I was not imagining the whole thing. The requests were real. The overages were real. The expectation that I would absorb it all was real. I was not being dramatic. I was being slowly drained. By then I had spent enough that I could have covered a decent used car. That number would have bothered me more if I had not been so focused on what came next. I had already learned that if I waited for fairness from my father, I would be waiting until I was old. So I made a different plan. I decided I would pay only what I had already committed to. I would not be rude. I would not explode. I would not create a scene before the wedding because I knew that would give my father a chance to make me the villain. Instead, I would let the receipts and the paperwork do what they were supposed to do. I would make sure every bill I had agreed to was paid. I would make sure every extra charge was documented. Then I would step back. If they wanted to tell the family I abandoned the wedding, they would have to do it while sitting on a stack of emails showing otherwise. That part mattered to me more than I expected. I did not want revenge. I wanted a clean record. A few days before the rehearsal dinner, my mother called. She and my father had been divorced for years, and she usually stayed out of family nonsense unless something major was happening. I had not told her everything yet, only that the wedding costs had gotten out of hand. When I described a few of the charges, she went quiet in the way people do when they are realizing they have heard this song before. She did not badmouth him. She did not tell me what to do. She only asked whether I had everything in writing. When I said yes, she sounded relieved. She said she had learned a long time ago that my father was best left to the facts, because facts were the one thing he could not bully. That stuck with me. Facts, not anger, not family history. Facts. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant attached to the hotel block I had already paid for, which meant I was already in the middle of the circus before it started. I arrived early because I wanted to check the final head count and make sure the bill was not going to balloon into another surprise. The manager handed me a printed estimate that was about $800 higher than the last one I had seen. I asked why. He explained that someone in the family had increased the wine selection and added an extra round of appetizers for a larger guest count than the original plan. I knew immediately who had done it because the handwriting on the special request sheet looked like my father's. I did not even have to ask. I pulled out my folder in the parking lot and found the copy of the approval email. There it was again. My father had sent another note to the restaurant saying the family wanted to take care of one more thing and that I was good for it. Good for it. Like I was a line item with a pulse. I stared at that email for a while, then I paid the rehearsal dinner anyway because I had already decided I was not going to let them make me look petty by walking away from a contracted meal full of people who had done nothing to me. But I also told the manager in writing that no future changes were to be processed without my direct approval. He agreed immediately. That was the first time I felt like I had the upper hand, not because I had won anything, because I had finally made the rules clear. The rehearsal dinner itself was miserable in a very polished way. People laughed too loudly. People made speeches about love and family and new beginnings. My father was in an excellent mood, which was almost worse. He kept talking as if the wedding was proof that the family could come together when it mattered. He made a point of telling anyone who would listen that I had stepped up in a big way. He called it generous. He called it responsible. He called it exactly what a good son should do. He did not mention that I had been asked to cover things by email, text, and in one case through a planner who had assumed I was already aware of a change I had never approved. The dinner ended late. I went home with a headache and a folder full of new receipts. The wedding day itself came too fast and not fast enough. By then, I had stopped thinking in terms of whether I would help and started thinking in terms of where the final line was. I knew I was going to pay for what I had agreed to. I also knew I was not touching anything else. I wore a suit, showed up on time, and kept my face calm. That was the hardest part. Once the ceremony began, I had to sit through 30 minutes of smiling and standing and pretending I was not mentally calculating how many days of work those charges represented. The ceremony was nice in a generic way. Nothing dramatic happened there. Matt looked nervous. Hannah looked beautiful and overwhelmed. My father looked like a man who thought the hard part was over and that the rest of the day would just validate everything he had already decided. During the photos, the photographer asked for a list of family groupings and seating changes. I checked my email later and saw that my father had answered some of those questions on behalf of the whole family again. Not to me. For me, that was the last little insult before I stopped feeling annoyed and started feeling done. By the time the reception began, every vendor had been paid for the amounts I had actually agreed to. I had also made sure the planner knew I would not approve any last-minute luxury additions. There were still a few minor balance issues, but they were attached to things Matt and Hannah had wanted after I had already refused to budge. I had the receipts. I had the emails. I had the messages. I had enough documentation to prove exactly where my responsibility ended. And then, right before the speeches, my father found me near the head table and gave me that smirk. It was not a huge expression. That made it worse. He looked satisfied, almost amused, like he had finally gotten me in the role he wanted. He said I was finally pulling my weight. That was the line he chose, not thank you, not I appreciate it, pulling your weight. It was the kind of phrase people use when they want help to sound like a moral obligation. I remember looking at him and feeling very calm. Not calm because I was fine. Calm because I was past the point of being manipulated by surprise. I had already done the work. I had already paid the bills. I had already saved the evidence. And I already knew exactly how the story was going to end. When the DJ handed over the microphone for toasts, I stood up before anybody else could grab it. That got a few heads turning right away, which was useful. My father straightened a little, probably thinking I was about to say something grateful. I was not. I took the microphone and told the room that this was my farewell gift because they would never spend another dollar of mine again. The room went silent in a way that felt physical. I kept my voice even. I said I had paid for nearly every major wedding bill that had come my way. I said I had the receipts for every one of them. I said I had covered the original agreements in good faith, But I was not paying for surprise upgrades, unauthorized changes, or people who used family loyalty as a blank check. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult anybody. I just stated the facts. I said I was done being the family ATM. Then I set the microphone down and left it at that. You could have heard a pin drop. My father did not say anything right away. He just stared at me like the room had somehow betrayed him. Matt looked stunned in the way people do when they realize the script they were depending on has gone missing. Hannah looked mortified, which was not fair to her, but she also had enough sense to know this had not come out of nowhere. Aunt and uncle faces around the room changed in real time. People who had been smiling politely suddenly looked interested in the details. That was the thing my father had miscalculated. He had assumed I would never say the quiet part out loud. He thought embarrassment would keep me obedient. Instead, embarrassment turned into proof. I walked out of the reception hall before anyone could turn it into a debate. I did not yell. I did not slam doors. I did not make a spectacle beyond the speech itself. I just got in my truck and drove home with my phone lighting up in my cup holder like a panic signal. At first, it was my father, then Matt, then a couple of cousins, then aunts, then the family group chat that had somehow become much more active after my exit. I ignored most of it until I got home. Then I sat at my kitchen table, opened the folder, and sent everyone the ledger, not the emotional version, the factual version, each bill, each payment, each approval email, each changed number, each note from my father saying I was handling it. I did not write a long explanation. I did not need to. The receipts did the talking. That part changed everything faster than any speech could have, because now nobody had to choose between my version and my father's version. They could read the messages for themselves. The first call I answered was from my mother. She did not sound shocked. She sounded tired and unsurprised, which was somehow both comforting and sad. She told me she was proud of me for not turning it into a screaming match. Then she said she was even prouder that I had kept the records. She was right. If I had only had a temper, I would have looked like the problem. Because I had documentation, I looked like the adult in the room. The next few days were chaos in a quieter way, not dramatic chaos, accountant chaos, vendor chaos, family chat chaos. The planner called me to confirm that my account was closed to new charges. The venue called to ask whether I wanted a copy of the final ledger for my records. I said yes. The photographer emailed to apologize for not questioning some of the billing changes earlier. The bakery refunded the unauthorized cake addition after reviewing the hold on my card. The hotel block stayed intact because I had already paid it and made sure no one could attach extras to it after the fact. Matt and Hannah went on their honeymoon, but the budget for it was suddenly much smaller than the version my father had been tossing around before the wedding. I do not know exactly what they said to each other in private. I did hear later that they had a hard conversation over the finances, and that Hannah was furious my father had let the spending run that far without being honest about who was paying what. That did not surprise me. If you are getting married and you do not know who is actually covering half the bills, you are not just dealing with a money issue. You are dealing with a trust issue. My father tried one more round of damage control in the family group chat. He implied I had humiliated Matt on his wedding day over a misunderstanding. That failed immediately because several relatives had already read the invoices I sent. One uncle replied with a summary that was so blunt it almost made me feel bad for laughing at it. He pointed out that there was no misunderstanding if the same person kept approving charges by email and then pretending he had not. That was the kind of line my father could not argue with. The family did not suddenly unite against him, but the tone changed. People who had been passive before started asking questions. A couple of relatives admitted later that they had assumed I was paying because I wanted to and not because I had been quietly pushed into it. That mattered less than the fact that they now knew better. The most awkward part was my brother. Matt and I had to talk after the wedding, not immediately. I needed a few days before I could stomach it. When we finally met for coffee, he looked worn out in a way that had nothing to do with the honeymoon. He admitted in his own clumsy way that he had not handled it well. He said he kept telling himself the numbers were all being managed because my father made it sound that way. He said he had not realized how much of the spending had drifted beyond the original plan until I showed him the ledger. I believed him to a point. I do think he was being steered. But he was also an adult, and part of adulthood is admitting when you let someone else make your mess because it was easier. I told him I was not cutting him off. I told him I was cutting off the arrangement. That distinction mattered to me. I did not want to lose my brother. I wanted him to stop acting like my silence meant consent. He nodded a lot during that coffee. He looked ashamed. He did not ask me for more money, which told me he had learned something. My father did not handle the aftermath nearly as well. He tried to rewrite the story several times. He told one relative, I had always planned to pitch in that much. and was now acting like it was a sacrifice. He told another that I was bitter because I had not been the center of attention. He told someone else that I was making Matt feel guilty on purpose. None of it stuck. The receipts were too specific. That was the beauty of having the paper trail. You do not need to argue when the timeline already explains the lie. A few weeks later, I got a call from my bank about a dispute on one of the smaller vendor charges I had already questioned. The charge had been successfully reversed because the planner confirmed the extra item had been added after the deadline and before my approval. That refund did not make the whole thing better, but it did make it feel less like I had donated money to a family scam. I used part of the recovered amount to pay for the bathroom renovation I had been putting off. It was not a dramatic purchase, but it felt symbolic. For the first time in months, I was spending money on my own house instead of on somebody else's chaos. That autumn, the family dynamic settled into a new shape. My father was less smug around me. He still tried to needle me now and then, but the effect was gone. Once people know you will produce receipts, they get less adventurous with your finances. Matt and I became careful with each other for a while, then slowly more normal. Hannah apologized to me in a text that was short and sincere. She said she should have asked more questions before assuming I was okay with all of it. I accepted that because it was true and because she had not tried to defend what happened. My mother was the one who understood the bigger lesson fastest. She told me she had spent years watching people confuse patience with availability. She said there is a difference between being generous and being available for extraction. That line stayed with me too. The whole thing changed how I handle family now. I do not give less because I am bitter. I give less because I have a boundary, and I know exactly what it costs to ignore it. I still help people when I can. I still pay my own way and keep my word. I also do not let anyone treat my reliability like it is a permanent resource they can mine without asking. I think that was the part my father never understood. He believed being the steady one meant I would absorb anything. He believed calmness meant weakness. He believed good record-keeping was just a quirk. What it really meant was that when I finally decided I was done, I would not be easy to gaslight. I would not be easy to shame. I would not be easy to confuse. I would have the dates, the numbers, the emails, and the texts. And once those were on the table, all the smirking in the world did not matter. Looking back, I am not proud that it took me so long to see what was happening. I am proud that when I finally saw it, I did not let anger make me sloppy. I did not blow up the wedding. I let the facts do that. That is the part my father still hates. Not the speech, not the embarrassment. The fact that I was calm enough to make the truth look larger than his version of events. A year later, the wedding is mostly just a story people bring up in awkward family conversations and then stop talking about when they realize I am in the room. My father and I are civil now, but there is a distance that was not there before. He learned that I can be pushed only so far. I learned that family loyalty is a lot easier to demand than to earn. Matt and I are okay. Not perfect, not as easy as before, but okay in a way that feels honest. And every once in a while, when somebody asks me why I bother saving receipts for things that seem minor, I think about that reception hall, that microphone, and the look on my father's face when he realized I had not been helpless at all. I had just been patient long enough to make sure the truth would land cleanly. That was the best part, not the speech, not the silence. The moment everybody finally had to look at the numbers and admit I had been right all along.